Climate change is an urgent and existential threat, and all countries have to build on the Paris Agreement to address this global challenge to humanity.
Welcome to Cities of Tomorrow, powered by ENGIE, where we explore what it takes for cities to achieve net zero carbon emissions amid Asia's rapid urbanization. This is your host, Matt Rickard. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Cities of Tomorrow podcast. Today I'm joined by Wandrille Doucerain, the Head of Business Development for Data Center Solutions. And we're here to talk about sustainable data centers. So yeah, thanks Wandrille for joining today.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me this morning. Very nice to talk about this very interesting topic. I myself is the head of data centers, business development for data centers in APAC for ENGIE. Basically, what we're trying to do is to bring, as you mentioned, sustainable data center, green data centers to market in the whole region.
Cool. So, look, let's jump in at the deep end, really. What is a green data center? Why is it important for our listeners on this podcast who may have not even heard the terminology before?
Yeah, absolutely. So may I just start with a few setting the stage type of talking around, what is a data center? So it seems like a silly question, but actually it's quite important to the topic at hand. So a data center is basically what we call a critical digital infrastructure, if you will. So when you started to use the internet, so Google was created in 1998. So data center is in itself a fairly new topic. And this is basically a big box where you have all the servers able to basically store, compute all the data that you would need for many things that you do in your everyday life, Matt. So basically this recording that we do from the Wi-Fi, basically the streaming that you use for watching Netflix, for example, all the storage for your pictures and your videos. Basically, all the data you're using have to go somewhere and have to be treated somewhere, and they would go into a data center, usually quite close from you. So these are the critical infrastructure that are being built first 20 years ago to a fairly small extent, like looking like computer rooms, and now we're looking now at much bigger infrastructure in tens of megawatts, and I'd be happy to walk you through what it means exactly. So this is, from a energy standpoint, a very important topic to tackle when you're talking about sustainability, because data center runs 24/7. It never stops for 20 years. So it's what we call a baseload type of asset, where you need power all the time, you need a cooling all the time. Why? Simply because servers, when they operate inside a data center, we need to be powered and we need to be cooled because they emit heat. So this is why we are, as ENGIE, working in that space, is to help these guys with increasing size of infrastructure to be decarbonized as much as possible in terms of power and in terms of cooling.
We're a very connected world now, massive amounts of connectivity, huge amounts of infrastructure, huge amounts of data. And obviously all of that equals a lot of energy consumption, which I know is where you're working. Singapore, I know, lifted its moratorium on data centers that was put in place in 2019. Why was that put in place? What have been the changes that have made that to be lifted?
It's a very interesting topic. Singapore in itself. Why? Because it's a constrained market. It doesn't have much size. So constrained in terms of size and also in terms of green power potential. So that's an important topic to have in mind. And also back to when they decided to basically stop new project to come online, is basically Singapore realized that data center are using a lot of power from the grid, roughly speaking 7 to 8% of the whole output of Singapore, which is massive actually. One of the first industries in terms of energy usage, and that it emits carbon, CO2. As you know, Singapore is a signatory of the Paris Agreement, of the COP21, and Singapore has committed to some sustainability goals, and they are willing to actually deliver on it. And so they allowed this pause time, if you will. So moratorium was more seen as a pause from a Singapore perspective to think about the best way to restart. Basically, the moratorium, from an ENGIE perspective or from a sustainability perspective, was a good news. Why? Because it would force the data center players to think in some other way or more sustainable way of designing and building and operating their data centers.
The key drivers around building green data centers would be great. I mean, you were starting to dig into those anyway, but there's sometimes, I think, this skeptical viewpoint when you talk about all of this energy consumption, all of this infrastructure. Can a data center really be green? And it'd be great to talk to some of that kind of area.
Absolutely. Data center can be sustainable in three ways, really. First, by design. Second, by supply, and third, by integration. Let me just explain a bit what I'm saying. So first, by design is basically about, while you're thinking about your new project development, asset development, the design phase is very key. Why? Because you would put all the equipment that you would need, you would design it in a way that it will fit as much as servers as possible in a given space. It's even more true for Singapore, where the space is constrained. So they are building high-rise data center. And the design, basically, the output of the design for a data center would be what we call the power usage effectiveness, or the PUE. There are many acronyms in the data center space. This one is very key. Why? Because it would give you the efficiency of the data center in terms of power used to basically service the server. So it's very key. Why? Because there is a clear link between the electric input that you need to actually create the IT power, as we say, so the computation power basically of your data center. So the relationship between what you have to put in terms of energy to create that IT power is called the PUE. It came from basically a level of 2, if you will, to a level of 1.2, 1.3, which is massive efficiency gains that we saw in the design phase of the data center. And today in Singapore, under tropical conditions, data center are operating at a PUE around 1.4, 1.3, which is quite efficient. So, and this comes at the design phase. The second way to make them more sustainable is by supply. So what I mean by supply is what kind of power do you use to run your data center. But what we see as ENGIE, being a global player and working with global data center players, is that this green supply is gaining traction like crazy. And we, just last year in 2021, ENGIE has sold nearly 2.1 gigawatts of green power to data center players. It's massive. It's huge. Yeah. So we are the second largest seller of green PPA. PPA being the power purchase agreement, so basically energy contracts that are stemming from wind, solar, hydro power type of assets. The specificity of Singapore is that you have limited potential, so it's very hard to be green by supply for a data center. So that's also why the moratorium came into place. The third way and all of these ways are basically levers that are non-exclusive to each other. So by design, by supply, and then by integration. Why do we mean by that? To also answer the question of skepticism on are you really green, is that a data center actually can benefit from the vicinity or the community around. Let me just give you an example. In Europe, there is a stance where we have a data center that we operate in a city, and the heat from the data center is used to warm the public pool. So this is what we call integration, i.e., there is some kind of a circularity from the data center to other, I would say, infrastructure around. It could be used, that heat also for industrial processes, etc. And it's a way to make it more sustainable. Why? Because you are useful to other assets, and it provides free of services for basically using eventually, to the size of a city or community, less energy. So in that specific case, you use less energy heating your pool because you're just taking a free heat that is actually given away by just powering the servers from the data center. So that's interesting. Brilliant. When you mix these three, design, supply, and integration, you can be truly sustainable and green. It's very hard in Singapore because of many reasons, and I'm happy to dig a bit deeper, if you will, on the Singapore context, but I'll pause now to have you speak as well.
Cool. Thanks. That was good. Thanks for clarifying those points. And for, people listening, we will share, obviously, notes around a lot of what you're talking about. Something that came to mind as you were speaking then, recently about some of those big numbers. The pandemic, thankfully, is starting to become a little bit of a distant memory. But what was the impact of the pandemic? We all know that with lockdowns and everyone was, I imagine, online more, there was probably more data being used. What was the impact of the pandemic in terms of data centers, and is that set to continue? Has there been a change since we've kind of come out the other end of it?
So very good question. I mean, the pandemic was an accelerator in the data center space for new project to be announced. And so we saw massive growth, especially in APAC where we are, you and I. When we say double digit, it's just an understatement. It's market. It's just tripling the size of the market itself. Why? It's not only because of using Teams or Zooms or etc. It's also about basically the recognition of many countries that they actually have to build up strong digital infrastructure, because it's becoming more and more of a sovereign type of topic. Everybody was, like you said, behind their computer. Everybody was behind their phone and all of that.
Zoom.
And what? Yeah, Zoom. That's basically the question that all these governments had to answer. What happens if my data center that I'm taking data from is too weak or not enough? So there are many policies became very friendly with data center development in many countries. So I'm thinking about the Philippines, I'm thinking about Indonesia, I'm thinking about Malaysia, Vietnam as well, starting to think that they are underserved in terms of data. And so it was a massive boost, basically, not only in terms of let's announce new project to come online, but also let's create the right conditions for these players to invest in the country to actually build data centers. So you need stability of the grid, you need a green power potential, and you need data policy that allows foreign companies to actually, come and do stuff, basically. That's the first effect. The second one is, which is interesting, is that you had the double effect of larger size data center. So from 5, 10 megawatt, 20 megawatt to 100, 150, 300 now, which is absolutely massive. Just to give you an idea, 1 megawatt of data center costs about 10 million USD.
Wow.
Okay, so basically a 100 megawatt data center costs 1 billion. Okay, so that's a massive asset. And now there is not a single week that passes by, in APAC at least, where you don't have a 200 or 300 megawatt project being announced. The second effect is that, so larger in size, but also closer to the click. Because when you're home and you're watching Netflix at the same time that your wife is doing some research on the internet, your kids are having a work from home or school at home, and you're working on WhatsApp, basically, also in parallel. Everything is basically demanding very low latency. So the second aspect is that we see an acceleration in smaller data center close to the click, i.e. in cities, etc. This is what we call the edge data centers. And it's very interesting to see these two parallel evolutions. So more data centers, very large size of project, but also very smaller size, but extremely close to where you are. It used to be only data centers close to, in the heart of the cities, only for banking purposes, typically for high frequency trading, etc. Now it's becoming also useful for basically streaming, online gaming, etc., where you need very low latency. So people at home working, playing, doing everything at home basically on a remote basis, accelerated these two separate trends that we see now unfolding in APAC. So altogether, it was a massive push for the data center industry.
Cool. And maybe a good segue as you talk about that kind of, massive scale and, the kind of projects you're dealing with. If we dive into the technology a little bit, in terms of improvements in data center efficiency, which I imagine is a big part of what you're looking at. Are those improvements incremental step changes, or, what are the improvements like? And are there any things on the roadmap that will have a big impact in the rollout of new data centers?
Yeah. So in the past 10 to 15 years, incrementally, but now we see the difference, the data center assets have been more and more efficient. So I would say that they're using twice less energy now on a PUE basis, as
in a 10-year period.
Yes, okay. more or less. So it's wow. Massive gains.
Yep.
So data centers are often looked at with a bit of a skepticism when it comes to efficiency, but actually they were quite amazing. I don't know which industry can say that they are twice as efficient as it was 10 years ago. So it's massive. Now we are reaching a point where the technology used will only offer incremental gain, energy efficiency gain. So this is a tipping point in many ways. And back to Singapore, where you have the call for application to exit the moratorium. Singapore is putting some very clear criteria, and I'm stating this because it could have an impact on the whole industry the way it's being designed, on how can you actually move to the next step in terms of data center configuration, not only incrementally having some better chillers or better crack units or UPSs, I mean, all the technical electrical elements of a data center, but in the design, having some innovation that will bring substantial gain in energy efficiency. So in that space, a few things have been identified, but are not yet completely up to scale, if you will, but will come online in the future. So the first one is about cooling. So just before I jump right into this, just to give you an idea, basically, when you run a data center, it will cost you a handsome amount of money because you need to pay for the electricity, you need to pay for many things. 60% of that cost will come from power and cooling. 40% in Singapore comes from cooling. So it makes sense to pay attention to this when you're a data center player because it will impact your P&L in a great way. So when it comes to cooling, which is a massive amount of operational expenditure, the one big innovation comes from liquid cooling, immersion cooling. So basically, it's about reducing the heat at the server place, not in I would say, atmospheric type of approach where you have all the servers producing heat and then you absorb that heat and you blast basically some AC. So you would run some fluid within the server to absorb the heat while it's being produced. But the impact in terms of efficiency are massive. Now it's being produced in some, I would say, small quantities by OEMs, so the manufacturers, but we know for a fact that based on the few tests that have been done here and there, you can gain around 75% of efficiency, which is massive when you think about it, as compared to today, which is already a good efficiency level, and roughly speaking, 80% of space less, because you can have very strong and very powerful high-density servers. So today, basically, servers operate at 5 to 8 kilowatt electrical per servers. Now we're talking with the liquid cooling and immersion cooling technology to go to 20, 30, even 60 kilowatt per server, because you can produce a lot of heat coming from processing power because you absorb the heat straight at the source. This could be a massive game changer in terms of land print and in terms of energy use. That's the one I just wanted to state. The whole industry is looking at it, and there are various levels of maturity in terms of design. Back to the sustainability by design. This one is really sustainability by design, but the design is very innovative, and it demands a bit of a mind shift, because you have some liquid running in some IT space, in some IT equipment, and you also have, if you push this even forward, you have a technology where you put your server in basically a bath. So they are completely immersed in a liquid. It's not water, it's a specific liquid, but it completely changes the way you actually design your data center. So that's one technology that could happen in the foreseeable future.
Cool. I have one more question. It's probably really for me the kind of the power question when we look at everything we've spoken about over the last 20 or so minutes. How far away today are we from net zero data centers in Southeast Asia? I think it's a big question that everyone would love to know. Yeah. And I assume that's really the kind of the journey here, the pathway, right?
Yes, absolutely. So I don't have a crystal ball, I have to tell you, but I'm on the ball when it comes to sustainability. In Southeast Asia, given the temperature, given the grid maturity in some countries, given the humidity, basically the environment for a data center is going to take a long time. I'm not going to lie. A carbon neutral or net zero data center in Southeast Asia is going to take at least 10 to 15 years to actually come onto line. Now, I'm talking about the data center being decarbonized at the very core, the very source. Today, if you want to have a fully green data center, the CO2 emissions are matched. You offset your CO2 emission. It's technically possible. You can get some green PPAs here and there, but the market is not going into that direction too much now. They're looking at 24/7. So this is Google commitment, 24/7. Every hour you need to prove that your data center is green, but still with some kind of an offset. Now the market and the population basically are expecting something a bit different, especially Singapore, back to Singapore. And they're looking at green ammonia, green H2, so green hydrogen, etc. And this will come online, and I'm not a specialist in that, to be honest, in the coming decade. It's going to take time. Now we have carbon neutral data center, net zero data center in Europe, in North Asia as well. So each time you are close to a water dam and it's quite cold and you can have some free cooling and you are integrated into a wider infrastructure where you can actually communicate with other assets, take some free cooling, give some waste heat, etc. You have truly today carbon neutral data center. So it's a reality. Okay, it's not greenwashing or whatever. And to answer your question, it's going to take at least a decade to happen.
Oh, 1 decade, not too bad. That's still pretty good going. Double improvement in the last decade, and
yes,
the next decade all to come. So I didn't have any more questions unless there was anything else you wanted to add that I didn't ask.
First, it was a pleasure to have that discussion with you, but I'd be happy to have some more episodes to potentially dig into more details in a few things that we have laid out today. But it was a pleasure. Data center is something that we'll have to work with. You cannot get rid of data centers. There will be more in the future. Now, the thing is that we have solutions to make them greener. In Southeast Asia is going to be a challenge, but we are on it. So you can count on NG and you can count on me.
Awesome. And look, I think we just scratched the surface. So look forward to digging in more there's probably 5 or 6 topics within this conversation that we could dig into on separate podcasts. So for anyone watching, listening, we'll put a QR code up on screen now so you can scan that and learn more about NG and the work they do. So thanks again, Wandrille, for joining
Thanks,
Cities
Matt.
Tomorrow podcast. All the best.
Thank you. All the best. Bye-bye.